The conference room smelled like burnt coffee and ambition, and Daniel Okafor was standing close enough to the supply closet that nobody had noticed him yet. He'd come back for his jacket, that was all. Left it on the chair after the Hartwell account meeting, walked out toward the elevator bank, realized halfway there. The lights in the glass-walled conference room were still on. Voices carried through the half-open door the way voices do when people think they're alone. "He still doesn't know," Vanessa was saying. Daniel's wife. 11 years married, and he knew the particular register of her voice when she was performing for someone she wanted to impress. This was that register. "I mean, can you imagine? 3 years I've been married to a man who thinks his father ran a shipping office in Lagos. A shipping office! Tobias, he doesn't even know what his own family is worth." A second voice, male, smooth. The kind of smooth that came from money old enough to stop trying. "And you're telling me this because I want you to understand what I'm walking away from to be with you. I could have waited. Let the lawyers find it eventually. Let it become my asset in the settlement. But I don't want his money, Tobias. I want this. I want you." Daniel stood very still in the hallway, one hand on his jacket, the air conditioning humming somewhere above him, and he did not move for the length of 11 full seconds. He counted them without meaning to. It was a habit from a different life. Count the silence. Control the breath. Let the moment finish before you let it touch you. Then he walked to the elevator, pressed the button, and went home. He did not confront her that night. He did not confront her the next morning either, when she kissed his cheek on her way out the door and told him she had a girls' trip that weekend. He simply made coffee, sat at the kitchen table in the small house in Hartsdale that he'd bought with a down payment from his own savings 9 years ago, and looked at his phone for a long time without dialing anyone. Before we go further, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy powerful, emotional stories filled with betrayal, secrets, and unforgettable revenge, don't forget to subscribe to Black Plight Tales, because this story, it only gets crazier from here. The kitchen clock ticked. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked twice and went quiet. Daniel turned the phone over in his hand, once, twice, and set it face down on the table. And for a long moment, he simply sat there in the gray morning light, the coffee going cold, the truth of what he'd just heard settling into him, slow and total, like water finding the lowest point in a room. Then he went to work like it was any other Tuesday. 9 years earlier, Daniel Okafor had arrived in the United States with 2 suitcases, a partial scholarship, and a name he had quietly trimmed down from Adaize Okafor to Okafor on every form that asked, because explaining the rest of it took longer than anyone in a registrar's office had patience for. He told people his father worked logistics back home. This was technically true. His father, Augustin Adaize Okafor, did oversee logistics for a maritime and resource conglomerate that controlled 40% of the shipping lanes feeding 3 West African ports, along with mineral concessions that had been in the family's stewardship since a set of agreements signed 2 generations back with the post-colonial government of a small, resource-rich nation, whose name Daniel had not said aloud to another American in 9 years. The dynasty was not a metaphor. It was a holding structure, layered through trusts in Geneva and Abuja and a minority government stake that made the family's conglomerate functionally inseparable from the nation's mineral export licensing. $15 billion, conservatively, across shipping, minerals, and the government concessions that ran through them both. Daniel was the only son. He had walked away from all of it at 23. He'd walked away the week his older sister, Adaora, told him their father intended to marry him off to the daughter of a parliamentary minister, to seal an export concession with marriage, the way the family had always sealed things, with blood, with proximity, with obligation disguised as love. Daniel had sat in his father's study, dark wood and ceiling fans, and listened to his father describe his future wife the way you'd describe a logistics contract. and something in him had gone cold and final. He didn't want a life assembled for him out of someone else's interests. He wanted, with a kind of aching specificity he couldn't fully explain even to himself, a life that was his, a love that picked him because of who he was when he had nothing to offer but himself. So he left. He took a name that fit on a single line, a scholarship to a mid-tier engineering program in upstate New York, and he built a small, unremarkable, deeply honest life as an electrical systems contractor, the kind of man who showed up on time and didn't overcharge and drove a truck with 140,000 miles on it. He met Vanessa at a hardware supply counter 4 years after he arrived. She was sharp, funny, ambitious in a way he found magnetic at the time. She wanted things, named them out loud, chased them without apology. He liked that about her. He liked it for years. He married her in a small ceremony with 11 guests, and he never told her about the conglomerate, the concessions, the trust accounts that still, quietly, accrued his 22% inheritance share, whether he touched them or not. He didn't hide it to protect an asset. He hid it because once, a very long time ago, a young woman in his university program had found out who his father was, and her entire face had changed, softened and sharpened at once, recalculating him in real time, and he had never forgotten the particular nausea of being recalculated. He wanted, more than he wanted almost anything, to be loved by someone who had done the math on him and landed on enough. He told himself Vanessa was that someone. He had been telling himself that for 11 years. The girls' trip was, in fact, a long weekend at a resort in the Hudson Valley with Tobias Renner, who ran a boutique investment fund called Renner Capital Partners, and who had, over the past 8 months, become something close to a fixture in Vanessa's life. A coffee here, a networking dinner there, each one explainable in isolation, each one part of a pattern Daniel had noticed and said nothing about, because he had learned a long time ago that some doors should be allowed to open themselves. 3 weeks after the overheard conversation, Vanessa asked Daniel to meet her for dinner at a steakhouse downtown, the kind of place with white tablecloths and a wine list thicker than a phone book. He understood, walking in, why she'd chosen it. He saw Tobias seated at the bar before he saw his wife, saw the easy, proprietary way Tobias lifted 2 fingers in greeting, the way a man greets someone whose evening he's already arranged. Vanessa was radiant. She dressed for an audience, and Daniel realized, sliding into the booth across from her, that the audience was him. "I want to be honest with you," she said, and there was no tremor in it, no apology preloaded into the sentence. "I've met someone. Tobias. Daniel, he's everything I didn't know I needed. He runs his own fund, he's brilliant. He sees a future I actually want to be part of." She said it warmly, almost kindly, the way you'd explain to a child why the family was moving to a new house. "I think some part of me has been waiting for permission to want more than this, than us. No offense, baby, but you've never exactly been ambitious. You fix wiring for a living. I love that about you, I really do, but I can't keep shrinking my life to fit inside yours." Tobias drifted over at some point. Daniel never registered the exact moment, only that he was suddenly there, hand resting with casual ownership on the back of Vanessa's chair, smiling the particular smile of a man who has already won and wants you to watch him collect. "No hard feelings, man," Tobias said. "Vanessa's told me a lot about you. Honestly, respect. Holding down a trade, keeping it simple. Not everyone's built for more, and that's okay." Daniel looked at the two of them for a long moment. He thought distantly of his father's study, the ceiling fans, the cold finality of being assembled into someone else's plan. He thought of 11 years, of the small, honest house in Hartsdale, of a truck with 140,000 miles on it that he had paid off himself, dollar by dollar, asking nothing from a trust he'd never touched. "All right," he said. That was all. He did not raise his voice. He did not list what he'd given. He placed his napkin on the table, stood, and walked out into the cold. And behind him he heard Vanessa exhale, not in grief, but in something closer to relief. The sound of a woman who'd been holding her breath through an obligation and had finally set it down. She stepped into Tobias's world that night like she was finally arriving somewhere she'd always meant to be standing. Daniel drove home in silence. He sat at the kitchen table where 3 weeks earlier he'd let a coffee go cold. He took out his phone, and this time he dialed. The call connected to Lagos. It rang twice. "Ado ora," he said when his sister picked up. "It's time." There was a pause on the other end. Not confusion, but the particular silence of someone who has waited 9 years for a sentence and finally hears it. "Daniel," she said, "are you certain?" "Activate the New York holding review. All of it. Tonight." "He never stopped asking about you, you know," Ado ora said quietly. "Father. Every month." "I know," Daniel said. "Start with Renner Capital Partners. Pull the concession-linked credit lines first." What followed over the next 11 weeks was not an attack. Daniel did not think of it that way, would not have used that word even in the privacy of his own head. It was simply the truth, arriving on schedule, the way truths do when they've been held back out of love rather than strategy. Renner Capital Partners had, 18 months prior, secured a critical piece of financing for its flagship fund, a credit facility backed, several layers removed through a Geneva-based intermediary, by mineral export concessions controlled by the Adeyeze Okafor Family Trust. Tobias didn't know this. He knew the financing had come through a strategic partner with ties to West African resource markets, and he had been told, correctly, that the relationship was stable, long-term, and unlikely to ever require his direct attention. He had built his pitch deck, his investor confidence, his entire expansion narrative on the assumption that this financing was permanent furniture. It was not furniture. It was a decision someone had made, and a decision someone could unmake. The family's holding company began, quietly and entirely within the bounds of its existing contractual rights, a scheduled compliance review of all credit facilities tied to the Mineral Concession Trust. A review triggered, the paperwork would later show, by routine fiduciary obligations following an internal beneficiary status update. Daniel's 22% share, dormant for 9 years, was reactivated with a single signature. The reactivation gave him standing on the trust's investment committee. The investment committee had final say on credit facility renewals. Ado ora called him every few days with updates, her voice steady and almost gleeful in its precision. The Lagos office flagged Renner's facility for review this morning. Standard procedure, on paper. Tobias has no idea it's connected to anything personal. He just sees a compliance letter from a fund administrator he's never had to think about before. "Don't rush it," Daniel said each time. "Let it move the way it's supposed to move." He went to work. He rewired a panel box in a house in White Plains. He quoted a job for a small bakery that needed its kitchen circuits brought up to code. He drove his truck home each night to a house that felt different now. Quieter, but not empty in the way he'd feared. He found, to his mild surprise, that he slept better than he had in over a year. Word reached him, secondhand, that Vanessa had moved into Tobias's apartment in the city within 2 weeks, that she'd quit her job at the marketing firm, telling colleagues she was focusing on building something with Tobias, that she'd posted a photograph from a rooftop event. Tobias's fund was hosting an investor showcase. The caption read something about new beginnings, and in the background, blurred but visible, was a banner with the Renner Capital Partners logo and a date 6 weeks out. The investor pitch. Daniel looked at the date for a long moment, then called Adara. "The showcase is the 22nd, he said. "Can the credit review conclude by then?" "It can conclude whenever we want it to conclude," Adara said. "Father's already signed off on the recommendation. We were only waiting on you to say when." "The 22nd, Daniel said. Let it land that morning. The Renner Capital Partners Investor Showcase took place in a glass-walled space on the 40th floor of a building overlooking the Hudson. 40-some chairs arranged in clean rows, a screen behind the podium displaying the fund's logo in cool blue light. Tobias had spent 4 months engineering this room. The catering, the guest list, the precise order of slides designed to walk skeptical capital toward conviction. Vanessa sat in the front row, in a dress Daniel had never seen, her hand resting on the empty chair beside her, saving it the way you save a seat for someone you want everyone to see you with. Tobias opened strong. He talked about disciplined growth, about a fund built on relationships too solid to shake, about the kind of long-term capital partnerships that don't show up in headlines because they don't need to. He clicked to a slide showing his fund's financing structure, and that was the moment his assistant's phone, set face down on the registration table near the door, began buzzing without pause. She read the first email and went very still. Then a second. Then she stood, half bent, and made her way along the wall toward the stage. And Tobias, mid-sentence, saw her face and faltered. "One moment," he told the room, smiling the smile of a man who still believed the moment was small. It was not small. The email, sent at 9:58 that morning from a fund administration office in Geneva, copied to 4 members of Renner Capital's compliance team and, as a courtesy required under the original facility agreement, to the fund's lead institutional investor directly, stated plainly that the credit facility underlying 40% of Renner Capital's deployed capital had been placed under immediate review following a beneficiary restructuring at the Source Trust, and that, pending that review, no further drawdowns would be authorized, and existing facilities would convert to an accelerated repayment schedule effective in 90 days. The lead investor, a sharp, silver-haired woman named Pat Halloran, who ran allocations for a state pension fund, and who had, 20 minutes earlier, been the most receptive face in the room, was already reading the same email on her own phone. She looked up at Tobias, and her expression had the particular blankness of someone recalculating everything she'd believed for the last 20 minutes. "Mr. Renner," she said, evenly, "can you explain why your primary credit facility is being pulled the morning of your raise?" Tobias laughed, a short, confused sound. "I'm sorry, pulled? There's no... Our financing partner is extremely stable. This has to be some kind of administrative error." "It says here," Pat Halloran continued, scrolling, "that the facility is tied to a mineral concession trust based in..." She paused on the unfamiliar foreign name, then looked up. "Tobias, whose trust is this?" Vanessa, still standing near the stage, had her phone out now too. Someone, a junior analyst, trying to be helpful, had pulled up the trust's public filing record, the kind of basic corporate registry search that took 90 seconds and that nobody in that room had ever had a reason to run before. The beneficiary restructuring document, filed that morning in Lagos and already indexed, listed the trust's reactivated 22% beneficiary. Daniel Okafor. Vanessa read the name twice before her brain would process it as the name she already knew. Her husband's name. Her almost ex-husband's name. Sitting inside a filing connected to a maritime and mineral conglomerate she had genuinely never heard him mention, not once, not in 11 years, attached to the exact financial artery that had just collapsed underneath the man she'd left him for, in the room she dressed up to be seen in. She didn't gasp. She didn't say anything at all at first. She simply stood very still, the phone in her hand, and the dawning moved through her, slow and complete, the way cold water moves through a body. The shipping office in Lagos, the family he never discussed, the calm he never explained, the 4 sentences he never exceeded, even when she'd handed him every reason to shout. All of it resolved in real time into a shape she had never once considered. Because she had decided 9 years ago on a hardware store loading dock that a man who installed wiring for a living had nothing left to discover.
Across the room, by the door, Daniel stood where he had been standing for the last several minutes, having walked in quietly during the opening remarks, unnoticed by everyone except Pat Halloran, who had clocked him the way she clocked everyone in a room, out of professional habit, without yet understanding why he mattered. Tobias was still talking, faster now, the practiced cadence of the pitch fraying at the edges. I want to assure everyone, this is a clerical issue. Our team is already on the phone with
Mr. Adaize Okafor, Pat Halloran said, not loudly, but clearly enough that the room turned. Is that you? Daniel walked forward, unhurried, the way he walked toward every job site he'd ever shown up to on time for. It is, he said. Vanessa's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Why didn't you tell me? She finally said. And it wasn't loud either. It came out small, almost childlike, stripped of the performance she'd worn for 3 weeks straight. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Behind her, Tobias had stopped talking entirely. The screen still glowed with the fund's blue logo, useless now, a backdrop for a different story than the one it was built for. Because I wanted someone who'd choose the man fixing the wiring, Daniel said, not the man who could fix everything else. It cost him something to say it. She could see that, even now, even through everything. His voice didn't rise. It never had, not once in 11 years. And she understood, standing in the wreckage of a room she'd spent 4 months helping someone else build, that the stillness she'd mistaken for a lack of ambition had been the most expensive thing in the building the whole time. He didn't wait for her to respond. He turned, nodded once to Pat Halloran, a courtesy, nothing more, and walked out of the glass-walled room, past the registration table, past the catering cart no one would touch now, into the elevator, and down 40 floors into a Tuesday that was, for him, already over. 6 months later, Tobias Renner operated out of a sublet office 2 floors above a dental practice in White Plains, a space a tenth the size of the 40th floor showroom, with a payment plan attached to his name that 3 separate former colleagues had described, off the record, as a cautionary tale we use in onboarding now. His name still opened a few doors, old relationships, residual goodwill, but every conversation now began with someone gently, politely asking what exactly had happened with the Geneva facility, and Tobias had learned to give a vague, practiced answer that satisfied no one and ended most meetings early. Vanessa moved back into a 1-bedroom apartment in Yonkers that fall. The friends who had filled her social calendar during the Renner months, the rooftop parties, the gallery openings, the group chat full of people who called her babe and never once asked what she actually wanted, drifted away with a speed that surprised her less than she expected. She was not punished by anyone. She was simply no longer useful to a performance that had ended. She took a job at a different marketing firm, smaller, quieter, and found herself some evenings sitting alone with a glass of wine, doing the slow arithmetic of a catastrophic miscalculation. Not with self-pity exactly, but with the particular clarity of someone finally seeing the whole shape of a decision she'd made in pieces. Daniel was unchanged. He still drove the same truck, now past 150,000 miles. He still quoted fair prices and showed up on time. He finished the bakery's kitchen rewiring job 2 weeks after the showcase, and the owner, a woman named Pearl, gave him a loaf of sourdough as a thank you that he ate at his kitchen table that same night, alone, with the radio on low. He flew to Lagos twice that year, once to sit, finally, across from his father in the study with the ceiling fans, where the two of them talked for 4 hours about nothing related to business at all, and once for his niece's christening, where he held the baby on the veranda and let his sister take a photo neither of them had needed 9 years to be ready for. He did not return to run the conglomerate. He sat on the investment committee twice a year, signed what needed signing, and went home to a small house in Hartsdale
that had never depended on anyone's approval to feel like enough. He was simply undeniable. He always had been. It had just taken the right room and the wrong audience for anyone else to see it.
The question isn't whether Daniel should have told her sooner. The question is, if the people closest to you only start counting your worth once a stranger does the math out loud for them, were they ever actually with you at all? Or just with whatever they assumed you didn't have?